The entire kingdom called her insane. They laughed when she hoarded food. They mocked her when she warned them. But when the enemy army surrounded their walls and starvation began to kill faster than swords, she became their only hope for survival. Welcome to a story of one woman who saw the truth no one else would believe. A widow, an Omega, a prophet of war in a time of false peace. If you want to know how the woman they called broken became the savior of an entire kingdom, stay with us until the very end. And don't forget to hit that like button and comment which city you're watching from. The sun hung low over the outer fields of Grenmar, casting long golden shadows across the frontier kingdom that had known peace for exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days. Not that anyone was counting anymore, except Sarah Vane, and she counted everything. She stood alone in the open-air drying shed behind her small stone cottage, her hands moving with mechanical precision as she cut strips of venison into uniform pieces. The meat came from the morning hunt, deer she'd tracked herself through the northern woods before dawn. Around her, dozens of drying racks stretched in careful rows, each one laden with strips of meat, fish, and preserved vegetables. The smell of smoke and salt filled the air, mixing with the sweet scent of wild herbs she used to cure the provisions. Sarah's fingers were stained dark from the work, her nails cracked and rough. Her black hair, streaked with premature silver at 28, was pulled back in a severe braid. Her face, once considered beautiful by pack standards, had grown gaunt over the past year, hollow cheeks, dark circles under gray eyes that rarely smiled anymore. She wore the same faded work dress she'd worn all summer, patched at the elbows and hem, an Omega Widow's uniform in a pack that had moved on from mourning. "Still at it, I see." Sarah didn't look up. She recognized the voice. Mira Thorne, one of the pack's beta females, and a woman who had once been something close to a friend. That was before Torrin died, before Sarah became what they now whispered about in the market square. "The meat won't preserve itself," Sarah replied, her tone flat and factual as she arranged another strip on the rack. Mira stepped closer, her nose wrinkling slightly at the overwhelming smell. She was dressed for the evening celebration, a flowing green dress that complemented her auburn hair, jewelry that caught the fading light. Everything about her screamed normalcy, celebration, belonging, everything Sarah had lost. "It's the harvest festival tonight," Mira said, her voice carrying that careful, gentle tone people used when they thought you were fragile. "The Alpha King himself is coming to the main square. There'll be music, dancing, food." "There's always food now," Sarah interrupted, still not looking up. "That's the problem," Mira sighed, the sound mixing pity with frustration. "Sarah, it's been a year. Torrin wouldn't want you to live like this. Hiding away, working yourself to exhaustion, refusing to rejoin the pack." Now Sarah did look up, and something in her eyes made Mira take half a step back. "You didn't know my husband," Sarah said quietly. "Not really. You knew the warrior who smiled at festivals and told jokes in the tavern. I knew the man who woke screaming from nightmares about the Eastern Front. The man who spent his last 3 months teaching me everything he knew about survival, about reading supply lines and troop movements, about understanding the difference between peace and the silence before a storm." "That was war paranoia," Mira said gently. The healers said he was broken by battle." Sarah turned back to her work. "Maybe he was. Or maybe he saw something the rest of you refused to see. And what's that? That peace never lasts." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncomfortable. Mira shifted her weight, clearly wanting to argue but not quite knowing how. "The war's over," she finally said. "The Eastern Kingdom signed the treaty. King Draven negotiated peace himself. Trade routes are open, borders are stable. For now. Sarah, the treaty was signed under duress with a kingdom that had just lost its crown prince and half its army. Do you really think proud warriors forget that kind of defeat? Do you think they'll honor peace forever just because they were forced to their knees once?" Mira opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Even if you're right, and you're not, what does it matter? What are you doing out here, drying meat like some kind of mad hermit preparing for the end of the world?" "I'm preparing for winter," Sarah said simply. "A long winter. The kind that doesn't end when the snow melts." "That's insane. That's survival." Mira stared at her for a long moment, and Sarah could see the exact moment when pity turned to something else, to that subtle mix of discomfort and dismissal that had become so familiar over the past year. "I should go," Mira said softly. "The festival starts soon. If you change your mind, I won't." "Right." Mira turned to leave, then paused. "People are talking, Sarah, about you, about all of this." She gestured at the drying racks, the stored provisions visible through the cottage's open windows. "They're saying you've lost your mind to grief, that you're becoming dangerous to yourself." "Let them talk. The council might intervene. They might declare you unfit." "To do what?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "To work my own land? To preserve my own food? To prepare for scenarios they're too comfortable to imagine?" "To care for yourself properly," Mira said, and now the pity was back, thick and suffocating. "You're an Omega, Sarah. You're supposed to be cared for, protected. I can protect myself. That's not how it works. That's not how our pack works. Torin protected you. Now that he's gone, the pack should mind its own business." Sarah set down her knife with deliberate care. "Tell me something, Mira. When you look at me, what do you see?" The question caught Mira off guard. What do you mean? Do you see someone who's grieving, someone who's broken, someone who needs to be fixed or managed or pitied?" "I see someone who's suffering," Mira said carefully. "Someone who's locked herself away from the people who care about her." "You see what you want to see," Sarah interrupted. "What's comfortable for you to see." But I'll tell you what Torin saw in his final days. He saw a woman strong enough to survive what's coming. He saw someone who could think past comfort, past denial, past the pretty lies people tell themselves when they're too afraid to face hard truths. "And what truth is that?" Sarah met her eyes. "That everything you're celebrating tonight, the peace, the plenty, the safety, it's temporary. And when it ends, the only thing that will matter is whether you prepared or whether you pretended." Mira shook her head slowly. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm truly sorry that grief has done this to you." She left then, her footsteps fading into the evening sounds of the awakening festival. In the distance, Sarah could hear music starting, voices raised in laughter and song, the sounds of a pack celebrating, of people who believed the good times would last forever because they desperately needed to believe it. Sarah turned back to her work, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. She had 6 more deer to process before the week was out, 40 pounds of grain to mill and store, a root cellar to expand, calculations to verify. The night deepened around her, but she worked on, a solitary figure bent over her preparations while the rest of the kingdom danced. The market square was alive with celebration 2 days later when Sarah made her weekly trip to trade for supplies. She'd timed it for early morning, hoping to avoid the worst of the crowds, but the festival spirit had lingered. Merchants decorated their stalls with ribbons and flowers. Children ran between the vendors, playing games and laughing. Even the guards seemed relaxed, leaning on their spears and joking with passers-by. Sarah moved through it all like a ghost, her presence noticed but not acknowledged. She wore her cleanest work dress, still patched, still faded, and carried a large canvas bag over one shoulder. Her first stop was the salt merchant, a gruff older man named Derek, who'd at least maintained a professional relationship with her. "Morning, Sarah," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Usual order." "Double it," she said, counting out coins. "And I need to know if you can source more over the winter." Derek's eyebrows rose. "Double? That's a lot of salt for one person." "Can you source it or not?" "I suppose, but then I'll pay a deposit now for weekly deliveries through next spring." She placed a small leather purse on the counter. "That's enough for 3 months in advance." The merchant stared at the money, then at her. "Sarah, that's your entire widow's pension. You can't—" "It's my money to spend as I see fit." "But what are you doing with all this? People are saying you've got enough dried meat and preserved food to feed an army. You've got root cellars full of grain. You're buying salt like you're provisioning for a siege." "What I do with my resources is my concern. It's the pack's concern when one of our own starts behaving like the world's ending," said a new voice. Sarah turned to find Marcus Thorne, Mira's husband and a senior member of the pack council. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, and confident in the way of those who'd never seriously been challenged. Behind him stood two other council members, Elder Wynn, a silver-haired beta female who'd helped birth half the pack, and Commander Frost, who led the local guard and had served with Torin in the Eastern campaigns. "Council business?" Sarah asked flatly. "Concerned pack business," Marcus corrected, moving closer. "We need to talk about your activities." "I'm buying salt. It's not illegal." "It's not normal," Elder Wynn interjected, her voice gentler than Marcus's but no less pointed. "Child, we're worried about you. This obsession with storing food, with preparing for some disaster that isn't coming." "How do you know it isn't coming?" The question hung in the air, simple and direct. Commander Frost shifted his weight, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "Because we have intelligence," he said carefully. "Scouts, trade reports, diplomatic channels. The Eastern Kingdoms are quiet. King Thane is rebuilding his capital, not his army. The treaty holds. For now. For the foreseeable future," Marcus insisted. "Look, Sarah, we all understand you're grieving. Torin was a good man, a strong warrior. His death was hard on all of us." "He didn't die," Sarah said quietly. "He was killed. In a border skirmish that wasn't supposed to happen during a ceasefire that wasn't supposed to break." The council members exchanged glances. Commander Frost spoke first. "That was an isolated incident, a rogue unit that didn't get word of the treaty in time. It's been investigated and explained away," Sarah finished. "Convenient. Tell me, Commander, in all your years of military service, how many isolated incidents did you see that were actually just the first warning of something bigger?" Frost's jaw tightened. "I'm not having this conversation in the middle of the market." "Then why did you start it?" "Because the pack is concerned," Elder Wynn said, stepping between them with practiced diplomacy. "Sarah, dear, you're spending all your resources on provisions. You're isolating yourself. You're making claims about coming conflicts that no one else sees evidence of. These are signs of..." "Signs of what?" Sarah's voice remained calm, but her eyes were hard. "Say it. Signs of mental instability? Of an Omega who can't cope without her Alpha? Of someone who needs to be managed for her own good?" "Signs of someone who needs support," Wynn said firmly, "and possibly intervention." "Intervention." Sarah let the word sit there, cold and clinical. "You mean declaring me unfit, taking control of my property, my resources, forcing me into pack housing where I can be supervised and medicated into compliance. If necessary," Marcus said, his tone brooking no argument, "for your own protection." Sarah looked at each of them in turn, Marcus with his confident authority, Wynn with her concerned compassion, Frost with his military pragmatism. Then she looked past them at the market, at the laughing children and celebrating vendors, at the pack living in blissful ignorance of everything her instinct screamed was wrong. "I'm going to tell you something," she said quietly, "and you're going to ignore it, just like you've ignored everything else. But I'll say it anyway, because when what's coming finally arrives, at least one person will remember that someone tried to warn you." "Sarah," Wynn began, "the Eastern trade caravans are running 2 weeks behind schedule," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the clipped, factual tone of someone reciting data. "All of them, not some, all. The Silk Road is experiencing bandit problems that didn't exist 6 months ago. The northern grain shipments are being rerouted through passes that add 10 days to the journey, which makes no economic sense unless the usual routes are no longer safe. 3 diplomatic couriers have gone missing in the past month. Minor functionaries, nobody important enough to cause alarm, but missing nonetheless. And your own border scouts are reporting unusual troop movements in the eastern lowlands, movements your council has classified as training exercises." She watched their faces change as she spoke, watched surprise flicker across their expressions. "How do you know all this?" Frost demanded. "Because I pay attention," Sarah said simply. "Because I talk to merchants and couriers and refugees, because I read the trade reports posted publicly at the guild hall, because I calculate travel times and supply costs and notice when the numbers don't add up, and because my husband spent his final months teaching me to see patterns where others see coincidence." "Those are disparate incidents," Marcus said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. They mean something is wrong," Sarah interrupted. "They mean the stability you're celebrating is an illusion, and they mean that when reality breaks through that illusion, this kingdom is going to face a crisis it's completely unprepared for." And you think hoarding food will save you? Marcus's voice turned sharp again, defensive. You think your little drying racks and root cellars will matter if what you're suggesting actually happens? I think preparation is better than prayer, Sarah said. I think action is better than denial. And I think that when people are starving, they'll wish they'd listened to the crazy widow instead of mocking her. That's enough, Elder Wynne said, her gentle tone hardening. Sarah, you're clearly not well. We'll be convening a formal council meeting to discuss your situation. Until then, I'll continue doing exactly what I've been doing, Sarah said. Preparing, calculating, surviving. And when the storm comes, you'll all remember this conversation. You'll remember that you chose comfort over caution, that you chose mockery over wisdom, that you chose to silence the one person who tried to warn you. She turned back to Derek, who'd been watching the exchange with wide eyes. My salt, she said simply. The merchant hurriedly packaged her order, taking her money with shaking hands. The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation parted as Sarah walked through, her bag heavy on her shoulder, her head high despite the whispers that followed her. Behind her, she heard Marcus speaking in low, urgent tones to the other council members, plans being made, interventions being discussed, the machinery of social control beginning to turn. Sarah didn't look back. She had too much work to do. The third major confrontation came exactly 1 week later, and this time it came from the top. Sarah was in her expanded root cellar, now a proper underground storage facility she'd spent the summer excavating and reinforcing, when she heard horses approaching her cottage. Multiple horses, moving in formation, military precision. She climbed the wooden ladder back to ground level, blinking in the afternoon sun, and found herself facing a sight that would have intimidated anyone. 10 royal guards in full ceremonial armor surrounding a single figure on a massive black warhorse. Alpha King Kyle Draven had come to visit the Mad Widow. Sarah had seen him before, of course, at festivals and public ceremonies. Everyone in the kingdom knew what their king looked like, but she'd never been this close, never been the sole focus of those sharp, calculating eyes that were said to miss nothing. He was everything an Alpha King should be, tall and powerfully built, with the kind of presence that dominated any space he occupied. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples despite his relative youth, 35, maybe 36. His face was all hard angles and sharp lines, weathered by years of command. He wore practical clothing rather than royal finery, though the quality of the materials spoke of wealth. This was a king who preferred function over flash. Sarah Vane, he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. We need to talk. Your Majesty, Sarah replied, not bowing but inclining her head respectfully. If this is about the council's concerns, I should inform you that I've broken no laws. I'm not here about broken laws. Kale dismounted in one fluid motion, waving his guards back. I'm here because my council is in an uproar about a widow who's apparently predicting war and hoarding food like the apocalypse is coming. I'm not predicting anything, Sarah said carefully. I'm observing patterns and preparing for probable outcomes. Show me. The command was simple, direct, and completely unexpected. Sarah studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his intent. Was this genuine interest or a prelude to judgment? Show you what exactly? Your observations, your patterns, your calculations that have my counselors so concerned they're calling for your immediate intervention and possible confinement. He gestured at the cottage, the drying sheds, the visible signs of her work. Show me why you're so certain war is coming. It was a test. It had to be, too. No king came personally to investigate the ravings of one disturbed Omega unless he wanted to make an example of her. And yet, there was something in his eyes, not mockery, not pity, something harder to define. Curiosity, maybe. Or the look of someone who'd learned the hard way not to dismiss warnings just because they came from unexpected sources. Sarah made a decision. Follow me, she said. She led him into her cottage, aware of the royal guards tensing as their king entered the home of a potentially unstable subject. The interior was sparse but clean, a single room with a sleeping alcove, a small kitchen area, and most of the space taken up by a large wooden table covered in papers. Maps, trade reports, supply ledgers, military dispatches copied from public postings, merchant testimonies transcribed from market conversations, weather pattern predictions, population density calculations, resource distribution analyses. Cale Draven approached the table slowly, his eyes scanning the organized chaos. When he spoke, his voice was different, less commanding, more genuinely intrigued. What am I looking at? The Eastern Kingdom's behavior over the past 6 months, Sarah said, moving to stand beside him. She pointed to a large map marked with different colored inks. Red marks are reported troop movements. Blue marks are trade route disruptions. Green marks are diplomatic communications that have either been delayed or gone missing entirely. Cale leaned over the map, studying the patterns. These troop movements are all classified as training exercises. Training exercises don't require full supply trains, Sarah countered, pulling out another sheet, a table of calculations. I cross-referenced the reported numbers of soldiers in these exercises with standard military supply requirements: food, water, medicine, equipment. The supply trains moving through these regions are provisioning for campaigns, not training. That's speculative. It's mathematics. Sarah's finger traced down the columns. A training unit of 500 men requires approximately 2 tons of supplies per week for a 2-week exercise. The caravans moving through these regions are carrying 15 to 20 tons. Either the Eastern Army has suddenly become incredibly wasteful, or they're provisioning for something longer and larger than training. Cale was silent, his eyes moving between the map and the calculations. Sarah pressed on. Then there are the trade routes. She indicated a different map, this one showing the major commercial paths between kingdoms. 8 months ago, the Eastern Silk Road was the fastest, most reliable route for luxury goods. Caravans preferred it because it saved 2 weeks of travel time. 4 months ago, caravans started avoiding it, claiming bandit problems. But here, she pulled out another document. The actual reported bandit attacks haven't increased. What has increased is the presence of Eastern military patrols along that route, patrols that are requiring additional inspections of all commercial traffic. They're controlling information flow, Cale said quietly, and Sarah felt a flutter of something like hope that he was actually following her logic. And resource flow, she agreed. If you're planning a military action, you don't want luxury goods flooding your potential opponent. You don't want trade relationships strengthening. You want isolation, separation. Reasons for common merchants to stop crossing borders. You're creating the conditions for conflict before the conflict begins. Cale straightened, his expression unreadable. My intelligence officers have reviewed the same data and concluded there's no significant threat. With respect, Your Majesty, your intelligence officers are telling you what you want to hear, or what they've been trained to see: obvious threats, clear provocations. They're not looking for the subtle preparation that comes before obvious action. And you are? An Omega widow with no military training, no formal education in statecraft or strategy? The question could have been an insult, but his tone was genuinely curious rather than dismissive. Sarah met his eyes. My husband spent 5 years fighting on the Eastern Front. Every time he came home on leave, he taught me what he'd learned. Not how to fight. How to think like a commander thinks. How to read terrain and supply lines. How to understand that war isn't about the first battle. It's about the preparations that make that battle possible. And before he died, he spent his final months making sure I understood one fundamental truth, which is that comfortable people don't see danger coming until it's too late, that peace makes people soft, makes them want to believe threats have disappeared just because they're not immediately visible, and that the survivors are the ones who prepare even when everyone else is celebrating. Cale was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving back to the table of evidence. Then he did something that surprised her. He pulled up a chair and sat down, gesturing for her to do the same. Walk me through it, he said. All of it. Every conclusion, every calculation. Show me why you're so certain. So Sarah did. For the next 3 hours, as the afternoon sun moved toward evening, she explained. She showed him the pattern of missing couriers. Not important enough to cause alarm individually, but collectively indicating that someone was testing border security and communication reliability. She demonstrated how grain prices in the eastern markets had been artificially suppressed, suggesting government stockpiling. She pointed out the seasonal nature of military campaigns and how all the current preparations aligned with a spring offensive window. She showed him her own preparations, The calculations for how much food a besieged population would need, how long certain preserved goods would last, how to create distribution systems that could feed thousands on minimal resources. She explained her expansion plans, the additional storage she wanted to build, the supply networks she was trying to establish. And slowly, carefully, she watched the Alpha King's expression change from skeptical interest to genuine alarm. "If you're right," he finally said, his voice low and troubled, "we're catastrophically unprepared." "You are catastrophically unprepared," Sarah corrected gently. "I'm just one person. I can't provision a kingdom. I can barely provision my own survival. But yes, if what's coming is what I think is coming, this kingdom will face a crisis that could destroy it." Kale stood, pacing to the window. His shoulders were tense, and Sarah could see the weight of kingship settling heavier on him with each piece of evidence he'd absorbed. "My council thinks you're insane," he said, not looking at her. "I know. They want you declared unfit. They want your resources seized and you placed under pack supervision. I know. They think I'm wasting my time even listening to you. I know." He turned back to her then, and his expression was deadly serious. "What if they're right? What if this is all just grief and paranoia? What if I let you continue and you're wrong? Then I'm a crazy widow who dried too much meat," Sarah said simply. "The kingdom loses nothing. I lose my dignity, but I lost that months ago when I chose preparation over social acceptance. And if you're right, then the question isn't what happens if you let me continue. The question is what happens if you stop me." The silence that followed was heavy with implication. Finally, Kael nodded slowly. "I need to verify some of this independently. Send scouts, consult with military advisors I trust. But," he paused, seeming to struggle with the next words, "but my instincts are telling me you're on to something, and I've learned the hard way not to ignore my instincts just because they're inconvenient." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "The council meeting to determine your status is scheduled for 3 days from now. I'll postpone it. That gives us a month, maybe 2 if I can delay longer. Use that time. Expand your operations, prepare as much as you can, and document everything. I want regular reports on your observations, your calculations, any new patterns you identify." "You believe me," Sarah said, and she couldn't quite keep the wonder out of her voice. "I believe you might be right," Kael corrected. "And I believe that if you are, you're the only person in this kingdom who's acting like it matters. That makes you either the most dangerous person I've met or the most valuable. And if your council discovers you're supporting me?" A brief, sharp smile crossed his face, the kind of smile that had won battles and crushed rebellions. "Then they'll learn something important about who makes decisions in this kingdom. I'm the Alpha King, not them. And if I choose to take the warnings of a prepared widow over the comfortable assumptions of complacent counselors, that's my prerogative." He left then, his guards falling in around him with practiced precision. Sarah stood in her doorway, watching the royal party disappear down the road, and felt the first stirring of something she hadn't allowed herself in a year. Not hope, exactly. Hope was dangerous. Hope made you vulnerable to disappointment. But possibility. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore in seeing what was coming. That maybe, when the storm finally broke, the kingdom wouldn't be completely unprepared. That maybe survival was possible after all. She turned back to her cottage, her root cellar, her endless preparations. The work continued as it always did. But now, at least, she worked with the knowledge that one person, one critical person, had listened. The calculations didn't change. The patterns didn't shift. War was still coming, but now at least someone else knew it too. The Alpha King's support changed nothing about how the pack treated Sarah, but it changed everything about what she could accomplish. Within a week of Kael's visit, a royal courier arrived at her cottage with a sealed document bearing the king's personal crest. The letter was brief and formal. Authorization for Sarah Vane to purchase building materials, hire laborers, and conduct trade negotiations on behalf of Special Royal Project Assessment. No details. No explanations. Just the king's signature and seal, and enough official weight to make merchants and craftsmen take her seriously, even if they thought she was insane. The rumors, of course, exploded. "I heard she's the king's mistress," one woman whispered in the market, not quite quietly enough. "That's why he's indulging her madness." I heard she's blackmailing him, another countered. Something about her dead husband knowing royal secrets. She's probably spelled him, a third voice added with absolute certainty. Omegas aren't supposed to have that kind of influence. It's unnatural. Sarah ignored them all and got to work. The first expansion project was the most visible and the most controversial, converting the old communal grain storage building on the eastern edge of her property into a proper provisions warehouse. The structure had been abandoned for years, deemed too far from the main settlement to be practical. Sarah saw it differently. Remote meant secure. Remote meant the pack wouldn't constantly be watching her work. Remote meant she could scale up without everyone counting her supplies and mocking her paranoia. She hired a crew of 6 laborers, outcasts mostly, people who didn't care about pack politics because they'd never quite fit in themselves. There was old Gareth, a carpenter whose hand shook from an old injury, but whose eye for structural integrity was flawless. Young Thomas and his sister Marie, orphans who needed work and didn't ask uncomfortable questions. Finn the Silent, a mute beta male who'd been injured in the same battle that killed Torin and communicated entirely through precise hand signals. And surprisingly, Commander Frost's youngest son Daniel, a 19-year-old who'd failed his warrior trials and was considered a disappointment to his decorated father. "Why do you want to work for me?" Sarah had asked Daniel directly when he'd shown up at her door that first morning. "Your father thinks I'm either mad or manipulating the king. Your family has status, resources, you don't need this." Daniel had met her eyes with a steadiness that reminded her painfully of Torin. "My father also said something else about you. He said you were the only person in the kingdom who acted like reality mattered more than reputation. I'd like to learn from someone like that." So she'd hired him, and together they began the transformation. The old grain building became a fortress of preparation. They reinforced the walls with additional timber, insulated against moisture with clay and straw mixtures, built elevated storage platforms to protect against potential flooding, and installed ventilation systems to prevent rot. The interior was divided into sections: dried meats, preserved vegetables, grain stores, salt reserves, medical supplies, tools and equipment, emergency water storage. Every evening, Sarah calculated and recalculated. Population of the kingdom, approximately 8,000 souls. Siege conditions. Assume no outside supplies for 6 months minimum. Daily caloric needs per person, roughly 2,000 calories to maintain basic function. Total requirements. The numbers were staggering. Even with her expanded operation, even working 16-hour days, she couldn't possibly provision the entire kingdom. But she could create a model. She could prove it was possible. She could build systems that could be replicated if, when, people finally accepted the reality of what was coming. 3 weeks into the construction, the Pack Council came calling again. This time they brought reinforcements. Marcus Thorne led a group of 8 council members, along with a handful of concerned Pack members who'd apparently been recruited to represent community interests. They arrived during the midday work break, when Sarah and her crew were eating simple meals under the shade of the old building. "This needs to stop," Marcus announced without preamble, gesturing at the construction. "This entire operation, it's causing unrest in the pack. People are frightened." Sarah wiped her hands on her work apron and stood. Frightened of what? Building repairs and food storage? "Frightened of what it represents," Elder Wind said, stepping forward with her perpetual expression of concerned compassion. "Child, you're creating a survivalist compound. You're sending a message that catastrophe is imminent. You're causing panic." "I haven't caused anything," Sarah interrupted. "I'm working quietly on my own property, employing people who want to work, and building something that will benefit everyone when it's needed." "When it's needed," Marcus repeated mockingly. "You keep saying that like it's inevitable, like war is just around the corner despite every piece of actual evidence to the contrary." "What evidence?" Sarah challenged. "The evidence your intelligence officers are feeding you? The reports that say everything is fine while trade routes collapse and troops mass on our borders?" "There are no troops massing on our borders." Marcus's voice rose with frustration. "We have scouts. We have spies. We have diplomatic channels. If there was a real threat, we would know." "You do know," Sarah said quietly. "I've shown you the data. I've explained the patterns. You just don't want to believe it because believing it would mean admitting you've been complacent." "That's enough," Commander Frost said, his military bearing making even that simple statement sound like a command. Sarah, I respect what you're trying to do. I even understand it, given what happened to Torin. But this, he gestured at the warehouse, this is excessive. This is preparation for Armageddon. And the king's support notwithstanding, the pack has legitimate concerns about your mental state and your influence on others. My influence? Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter. What influence? I'm the crazy widow everyone mocks. I'm the broken Omega who can't accept peace. What possible influence could I have? You have 6 people working for you, Wynne pointed out. 6 people who are now caught up in your paranoia, spreading your theories. We're not caught up in anything, Daniel spoke up suddenly, surprising everyone, including Sarah. We're employed, we're learning skills, and we're building something practical that will serve the kingdom regardless of whether Sarah's predictions come true. You're a child, his father snapped. You don't understand. I understand that everyone said peace was permanent last time too, Daniel shot back. I understand that my oldest brother died in a permanent peace that lasted exactly 18 months. I understand that when the next war broke out, half the kingdom starved because we dismantled our emergency stores to celebrate the peace dividend. I was 8 years old, but I remember. Do you? The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. Commander Frost's face had gone pale, then red with suppressed emotion. That was different, he finally said, his voice tight. We learned from that. We have better systems now, better intelligence, better denial, Sarah said quietly. You've just gotten better at convincing yourselves that this time it's different, that this peace is real, that preparation is paranoia and caution is cowardice. This conversation is over, Marcus declared. The council has voted. You have 2 weeks to cease this operation. Dismiss your workers, stop your hoarding activities, and submit to a psychological evaluation by the pack healers. If you refuse, we will petition the king to revoke his support and declare you unfit to manage your own affairs. You can't do that, old Gareth growled, standing up from where he'd been watching the confrontation. She's got royal authorization. You can't just… Royal authorization can be revoked if the subject proves incompetent or dangerous, Marcus interrupted. And this behavior qualifies as both. Sarah felt the familiar cold calculation settling over her thoughts, the same mental state that had gotten her through the worst of her grief. Emotion was useless right now. What mattered was strategy. I'll make you a deal, she said, her voice perfectly level. You're afraid I'm wrong, that I'm wasting resources and causing panic over nothing. Fine. Give me 30 days. 1 month. If nothing has changed in 30 days, if there's no evidence of increased military activity, no further disruptions, no signs of imminent conflict, then I'll submit to your evaluation. I'll accept whatever the healers determine. But if there is evidence, if any of my predictions prove accurate, then you leave me alone and you start listening. The council members exchanged glances. Marcus looked ready to refuse outright, but Elder Wynne put a hand on his arm. That's not unreasonable, she said carefully. A month isn't long, and if nothing happens, we can resolve this with her cooperation rather than through force. And if something does happen, Commander Frost asked, his eyes on Sarah. Then you admit I was right, Sarah said simply, and you let me help you prepare properly instead of pretending I'm the problem. The negotiations took another 20 minutes, with terms being clarified and conditions being set. Finally, grudgingly, the council agreed. 30 days. If the kingdom remained at peace, Sarah would submit to evaluation. If evidence emerged supporting her claims, the council would publicly acknowledge their error and provide support for expanded preparation efforts. As the council departed, Daniel moved to stand beside Sarah. They're going to try to discredit you before the month is up, he said quietly. My father's already planning it. I can tell. I know, Sarah replied, watching the council members disappear down the road. But I don't need 30 days to be proven right. I need about 12. How do you know? Because the Eastern campaign season starts in spring, which means their final preparations will become visible in early fall, which is, she consulted her mental calendar, about 2 weeks from now. I won't have to wait 30 days. Reality will do the work for me. She was wrong about the timeline, but only by 4 days. The first confirmation came from an unexpected source, a merchant caravan that limped into Grenmar's market square 18 days after the council's ultimatum. Sarah heard about it within an hour, dropped her work immediately, and went to find them. The caravan master was a weathered woman named Kira, someone Sarah had traded with regularly before Torrin's death. She was sitting outside the healer's building, her arm in a fresh sling, her face covered in barely scabbed cuts. "Bandits?" Sarah asked, sitting down beside her without invitation. Kira laughed bitterly. "That's the official story, isn't it? Always bandits. Never what it actually is." "What was it actually?" "Eastern military checkpoint," Kira said flatly. "Not marked, not announced, just suddenly there on the old Silk Road. 20 soldiers in full armor demanding emergency tariffs and searching every wagon down to the wheel spokes. When my second refused to let them break into our sealed shipments, they beat him unconscious and confiscated half our goods as suspicious materials." Sarah's heart was pounding, but her voice remained calm. "When did this happen?" 5 days ago. Took us this long to get here because they kept our horses too, said we could have them back after their investigation was complete." Kira spat on the ground. "Investigation. They're seizing resources and controlling movement. That's not peacetime behavior, Sarah. That's pre-war positioning." "Did you report this to the council?" "Tried to. Marcus Thorne told me I was overreacting. Said it was probably just an overzealous local commander exceeding his authority. Said the Eastern King would sort it out through diplomatic channels." Kira met Sarah's eyes. "But you know what? I've been running trade routes for 23 years. I know the difference between an overzealous commander and systematic military control. This wasn't random. This was policy." Sarah spent the next 3 days tracking down every merchant, courier, and traveler who'd crossed the eastern borders in the past month. She compiled testimonies, cross-referenced locations, mapped checkpoint patterns. The picture that emerged was undeniable. The Eastern Kingdom was closing its borders. Not obviously, not officially, but through a systematic network of temporary checkpoints, security measures, and administrative delays, they were choking off trade and controlling information flow. Classic pre-campaign strategy: isolate your opponent, limit their resources, ensure they don't see you mobilizing until it's too late. Sarah brought her findings to the Alpha King on the morning of the 20th day. She was escorted to the castle by royal guards, drawing stares and whispers from every person she passed. The crazy widow, going to poison the king's mind with more paranoid fantasies. Kale received her in his private study rather than the throne room, a deliberate choice that she recognized as both a courtesy and a tactical decision. This was a working meeting, not a public audience. "Show me," he said without preamble, the moment the door closed behind them. Sarah spread her maps and testimonies across his desk, walking him through each piece of evidence with precise, clinical detail. She watched his expression darken with each new revelation. "My intelligence officers assured me the checkpoint reports were isolated incidents," he said when she finished. "Bureaucratic overstep, nothing systematic." "Your intelligence officers are either incompetent or compromised," Sarah said bluntly. "This isn't isolated, this is coordinated, and it's accelerating." Kyle stood, pacing to the window that overlooked his kingdom. "If you're right, and I'm increasingly certain you are, we have a serious problem. Our military readiness has been scaled back significantly since the treaty. Our reserve forces are scattered. Our supply lines are optimized for peacetime commerce, not wartime logistics. How long would it take to mobilize? Full mobilization, 6 weeks minimum. And that's if we start immediately and don't worry about causing panic." He turned back to her. "Which I can't do without proof that would satisfy the council and the nobility. If I start war preparations based solely on your observations and merchant testimonies, I'll face internal rebellion. Half my own advisors will think I've lost my mind." "Then we need proof they can't dismiss," Sarah said. "Something undeniable." "Like what? An invasion?" The bitter sarcasm in his voice mirrored her own frustration, but Sarah's mind was already working through possibilities. "Not an invasion. A defection," she said slowly. "Someone from the Eastern military willing to confirm that mobilization is underway. Someone whose testimony would carry weight. If such a person exists, my spies would have found them already. Your spies are looking in the wrong places. They're looking for high-level officials, for people in the command structure who might betray their king for money or ideology. But the best intelligence doesn't come from commanders. It comes from logistics officers, supply masters, the people who actually move armies and know exactly what resources are being positioned where." Kale was silent for a moment, his sharp mind clearly working through the implications. You're suggesting I redirect intelligence efforts toward lower-level Eastern military personnel, people who handle supplies rather than strategy. I'm suggesting we find someone who knows what's being moved and where and in what quantities. Someone who can provide concrete data on troop provisions, ammunition stores, medical supplies. The kind of information that proves intent beyond any doubt. That could take weeks, months even. We don't have months, Sarah said quietly, but we might have weeks. If I'm right about the timeline, the Eastern Kingdom will launch their campaign in early spring, which means they're in final preparation phase now, which means their logistics are at maximum visibility. This is actually the easiest time to get that intelligence, if we're looking in the right places. Kale returned to his desk, studying her maps with the intensity of someone who'd commanded armies and understood exactly what she was describing. I'll redirect resources, he finally said, quietly, without alerting my council to what I'm doing or why. But Sarah, he looked up at her, this needs to produce results quickly. Your 30-day agreement with the council is running out. If we don't have solid evidence before that deadline, they're going to force the evaluation issue. And if I'm seen supporting you against a formal council decision without ironclad justification, I'll create a political crisis that could tear this kingdom apart from the inside just when we need unity most. Understood. There's something else. Kale's voice dropped lower, more personal. People are talking about us, about why I'm supporting you. The rumors range from scandalous to ridiculous, but they're all undermining your credibility and mine. The longer this goes on without resolution, the worse it gets. I know, Sarah said simply. I'm either your mistress, your manipulator, or your deluded pet project depending on who you ask. It doesn't matter. Let them think what they want. It matters if it affects the kingdom's stability. The kingdom's stability will be affected a lot more by the army that's about to invade it than by rumors about the Alpha King's poor judgment and advisors. Despite the gravity of the situation, a brief smile flickered across Kale's face. You have a talent for putting things in perspective. I have a talent for survival, Sarah corrected. Everything else is just applied logic. She left the castle through a side entrance, avoiding the main corridors where courtiers gathered and whispered, but she couldn't avoid the market square, and she couldn't avoid the scene that awaited her there. A crowd had gathered outside Elder Wyn's healing house, and at the center of it stood Marcus Thorne, Commander Frost, and several other council members. They'd clearly been waiting for news of her meeting with the king. There she is, Marcus called out loudly, ensuring everyone heard. The woman who's managed to bewitch our Alpha King into wasting resources and attention on phantom threats. Sarah stopped, considering whether to engage or simply walk past. The crowd's energy was hostile, feeding off the council's obvious disapproval. These were her pack members, people she'd lived among her entire life. Now they looked at her like she was something toxic. I'm not bewitching anyone, she said calmly, loudly enough for everyone to hear. I'm providing information and analysis based on observable patterns. If the king chooses to take that seriously, it's because he understands the cost of being unprepared. The cost, Commander Frost repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. You want to talk about cost? You've employed 6 people to build your paranoid fortress. You've hoarded enough food to feed a village. You've spent your entire widow's pension and then some on your obsession. And for what? To feed delusions that the rest of us are too comfortable to see? To feed people when they're starving, Sarah shot back. Which they will be when reality catches up with your denial. Enough, Elder Wynn said, but her voice lacked its usual gentle authority. She looked tired, frustrated. Sarah, child, this has gone too far. Your 30 days are nearly up. In 10 more days, you've agreed to submit to evaluation. Until then, the least you can do is stop spreading fear. I'm not spreading fear. I'm preparing for reality. Your reality, Marcus sneered. Not actual reality. Just the nightmare world you've constructed to justify your inability to move on from grief. Something inside Sarah snapped, not into anger. She was too exhausted for anger. Into something colder, harder, more final. You want to know about grief? She said, her voice cutting through the crowd noise like a blade. Grief is watching your husband die from injuries that shouldn't have happened during a piece that wasn't real. Grief is being told it was an accident, an anomaly, nothing to worry about. Grief is knowing that Torin saw this coming, warned everyone who would listen, and died because no one took him seriously. She looked around the crowd, meeting eyes that quickly looked away. But this isn't about grief anymore. This is about mathematics. This is about trade route data and supply chain analysis and military logistics. This is about patterns that don't lie just because we want them to. And if you can't see those patterns, if you can't accept what they mean, then you're not comfortable. You're blind. And blindness in the face of danger isn't peace. It's suicide. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Marcus seemed momentarily at a loss for words. 10 days, Elder Wynne finally said, her voice sad but firm. 10 more days, Sarah. Then this ends, one way or another. Sarah nodded once and walked away, ignoring the whispers that erupted behind her. She had work to do. 10 days to be proven right. 10 days until reality forced everyone to face what she'd been trying to tell them all along. She just hoped 10 days would be enough. That evening, working alone in her warehouse by lamplight, Sarah heard horses approaching. Her crew had gone home hours ago. The isolation she usually preferred suddenly felt vulnerable, exposed. But when she stepped outside, she found not the council or angry pack members, but a single rider on a lathered horse. The man half fell from the saddle, exhausted and bleeding from a wound on his shoulder. "Royal Courier," he gasped, showing her a sealed tube bearing Kael's crest. "Urgent, for you. The king said—" He swayed. "Said you'd understand." Sarah caught him before he fell, helped him inside, and tended to his wound with supplies from her medical stores while he gulped water. Only then did she open the tube. Inside was a single sheet of parchment covered in Kael's precise handwriting, and a separate sealed document with an official Eastern military stamp. The letter was brief. "Sarah, one of our merchants convinced an Eastern supply officer to defect. The attached document is an inventory requisition for the Eastern Army's spring campaign. The numbers confirm everything you predicted. I need you to verify the calculations and provide analysis. We have 48 hours before I must present this to the council. Make it undeniable. K." Sarah unfolded the requisition document with shaking hands. It was written in Eastern military code, but Torin had taught her to read that code years ago, during his paranoid final months when he'd made her learn everything he knew. She read. She calculated. She cross-referenced against her own supply estimates. And as dawn broke over the kingdom, she finished her analysis with one cold, terrible certainty burning in her chest. The Eastern Kingdom wasn't just preparing for war. They were preparing for conquest. The supply requisitions weren't for a limited campaign or a border dispute. They were for a sustained offensive designed to capture and hold territory. And based on the quantities, the timing, and the staging locations, Grenmar was the primary target. The invasion was coming, not in months, in weeks, maybe days. And absolutely no one was ready. Sarah worked through the night with a focus that bordered on possession. Her fingers stained with ink as she translated supply codes and cross-referenced troop movements against terrain maps. The exhausted courier slept in her front room while she filled page after page with calculations that grew more horrifying with each completed line. 30,000 troops, 6-month provision stores, siege equipment requisitions including mangonels, battering rams, and climbing ladders, medical supplies calculated for 20% casualties, standard for offensive operations. And most damning of all, a detailed inventory of occupation supplies, administrative materials, civilian management protocols, long-term food distribution systems for a conquered population. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't even a standard military campaign. This was a planned annexation. By the time the sun rose, Sarah had produced a 15-page analysis that laid out exactly what was coming, when it would arrive, and what it would take to survive it. The numbers were brutal. Grenmar's standing army numbered barely 8,000, most of them scattered across garrison posts throughout the kingdom. The capital's walls could hold against assault, but only if they had sufficient supplies to outlast a siege. Current stores would last perhaps 6 weeks under rationing. The Eastern Army could sit outside those walls for 6 months without breaking a sweat. She was packaging the documents when Daniel arrived for the morning work shift, his face pale with exhaustion. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "My father knows about the defector. He's calling an emergency council session this morning. They're going to try to discredit the intelligence before the king can act on it." "How does he know?" Someone in the castle is feeding information to the council, probably one of the king's own advisors who thinks supporting you is making him look weak. Daniel moved closer, lowering his voice. Sarah, they're planning something. I heard my father and Marcus talking last night. They said if they can't stop the king from taking your warning seriously, they'll stop you directly. What does that mean? I don't know, but my father doesn't make idle threats. He's convinced you're destabilizing the kingdom, and he's prepared to act decisively to prevent that. Sarah felt the familiar cold calculation settling over her thoughts. She'd expected resistance, but Commander Frost moving against her directly was a dangerous escalation. He had military authority, loyal troops, and the respect of enough council members to make any action he took seem legitimate rather than tyrannical. I need to get this analysis to the king before the council session, she said, holding up her completed package. Can you— I'll take it, the courier said from the doorway, awake now and moving stiffly. That's what I was sent for. But we need to move fast. If the council's already in session, they'll have guards watching every approach to the castle. There's a servant's entrance on the east wall, Daniel said quickly. My brother used to sneak out through it when we were younger. If we go now, before the household fully wakes— We? Sarah cut in. You think I'm letting you walk into that alone? If my father's planning something, you need witnesses. People who can testify that you weren't doing anything threatening or unstable, just delivering military intelligence to your king. The logic was sound, even if the risk wasn't. But Sarah was running out of time and options. She grabbed her analysis, sealed it carefully, and followed Daniel and the courier into the pre-dawn streets of Grenmar. They made it halfway to the castle before the ambush. 6 men stepped out of an alley near the market square, and Sarah recognized them immediately, pack enforcers, the men who handled security issues when the council needed something done quietly. Leading them was Marcus Thorne himself, his expression a mixture of grim determination and something that looked uncomfortably like satisfaction. That's far enough, he said, blocking their path. Sarah Vane, by order of the Pack Council and in accordance with emergency protocols, you are to be detained for psychological evaluation pending formal hearing. The 30 days aren't up, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her pounding heart. We had an agreement. The agreement was contingent on you not causing active harm to the kingdom's stability. Your continued agitation of the Alpha King, your unauthorized collection of sensitive military intelligence, and your attempts to circumvent council oversight constitute a clear and present danger. Marcus gestured to his enforcers. Take her into custody. This is illegal, Daniel said, stepping between Sarah and the approaching men. She has royal authorization. You can't just— Stand aside, boy, Marcus snapped, or you'll be detained alongside her for interfering with council business. Let them try, the courier said quietly, his hand moving to the sword at his belt. I'm royal guard. Anyone who touches this woman or these documents is obstructing the king's direct orders. The standoff hung in the balance for a long, tense moment. Marcus's enforcers outnumbered them, but attacking a royal courier was treason. The men hesitated, looking to Marcus for guidance. And in that moment of hesitation, bells began ringing throughout the city. Not the normal morning bells, not the market bells or the temple bells or any of the familiar sounds of a city waking. These were alarm bells, harsh and urgent, coming from the northern watchtowers. Everyone froze. What is that? One of the enforcers asked. That's the siege warning, Daniel said, his face draining of color. That's the sound they use when enemy forces are approaching the capital. Marcus's expression went from confident to confused to horrified in the span of 3 seconds. That's impossible. We have no reports of— He was interrupted by a guard sprinting into the square, his armor askew and his face panicked. Eastern Army the guard shouted to anyone who would listen. Eastern Army spotted 5 miles north, thousands of them. They're burning the outlying villages and moving on the capital. The market square erupted into chaos. People began screaming, running for their homes or toward the castle, or simply running without direction because panic had overwhelmed rational thought. Marcus stood frozen, his worldview visibly shattering in real time. But we had no warning, he whispered. No reports, no scout intelligence, no diplomatic communications. You had warnings, Sarah said coldly, clutching her documents. You just refused to believe them. She didn't wait for his response. She grabbed Daniel's arm and pushed through the panicking crowd with the courier at their heels. The castle was their only destination now, not to deliver her analysis, but to reach the one person who might be able to turn this disaster into something survivable. The castle was in controlled chaos when they arrived. Guards were mobilizing, commanders were shouting orders, civilians were being directed to defensive positions or evacuation routes. Sarah pushed through it all with single-minded determination until she found Kyle in the war room, surrounded by maps and shouting officers. "Your Majesty," she said, and the authority in her voice cut through the noise. Everyone turned to stare at the disheveled Omega woman who'd just interrupted a war council. Kyle's eyes found hers across the room, and in them she saw exhaustion, fury, and something that might have been relief. "Clear the room," he ordered. Everyone except Commander Frost's staff and primary advisors. Now. The room emptied in seconds, leaving only Kyle, Sarah, 4 senior military officers, and Elder Wynn, who'd apparently been summoned to help coordinate civilian response. The courier took up position by the door while Daniel remained at Sarah's side. "Report," Kyle said simply. "Eastern Army, estimated 30,000 troops, 5 miles north and advancing," one of the officers said, his voice tight with stress. "They've taken the villages of Northridge, Milford, and Creston, burned them completely. Survivors are flooding toward the capital, reporting no warning, no demands, just immediate attack." "How did they get that close without our scouts detecting them?" Kyle's voice was dangerously quiet. "We don't know, sir. Our northern outposts either never sent warning or they were neutralized first," Sarah interrupted. "Standard infiltration tactics. Take out the early warning system before the main force advances. You didn't see them coming because they made sure you couldn't." The officers turned to stare at her with varying expressions of shock and hostility. Elder Wynn actually gasped. "This woman has no place in a war council," one of the officers said. "Your Majesty, with all respect, this woman predicted everything that's happening right now," Kyle cut in. "And while all of you were assuring me the Eastern Kingdoms were peaceful, she was preparing for exactly this scenario. So right now, she has more credibility in this room than anyone else." He turned to Sarah. "Do you have the analysis?" She handed him the sealed documents. He broke the seal and read quickly, his expression darkening with each page. Finally, he looked up, his eyes haunted. "They're planning a siege, 6-month duration, full occupation protocols." He looked at his officers. "What are our current provisions?" "Enough for 6 weeks under strict rationing, sir," one of them admitted reluctantly. "We scaled back reserves after the treaty to fund other priorities." "Other priorities," Kale repeated, his voice like ice. "We starve in 6 weeks, and they can sit out there for 6 months. Anyone want to explain how that's an acceptable military posture?" Silence. "Your Majesty," Elder Wynn said carefully, "perhaps we should focus on evacuation. If we can't hold the capital, we should save as many civilians as possible." "Evacuate where?" Sarah challenged. "They've burned the northern villages. They'll have forces positioned to intercept anyone fleeing south or east. The western mountains are impassable this time of year. There's nowhere to evacuate to that isn't either controlled by the enemy or a death trap." "Then what do you suggest?" Wynn's voice carried an edge now, fear breaking through her usual composure. "That we just surrender?" "I suggest we survive," Sarah said. "You have 8,000 people in this capital right now. In 6 weeks, you'll start losing them to starvation, unless—" She looked at Kyle. "Unless you have access to additional supply sources no one knows about." Understanding flickered across the king's face. "Your stores." "My stores," Sarah confirmed. "I have enough preserved food to feed approximately 1,000 people for 6 months, or 8,000 people for 6 weeks. Which means if we combine what I've prepared with what the kingdom has, we can extend survival from 6 weeks to—" She did rapid mental calculations. "Approximately 3.5 months. Maybe 4 if we implement aggressive rationing and supplemental food production." "That's still not 6 months," one of the officers pointed out. "No, but it's enough time for allies to mobilize and break the siege. The Western Kingdoms are treaty-bound to support us if we're invaded. If we can hold for 4 months, if we can keep the population alive and the defenses intact, help will come." Kyle looked at his officers. "Is this militarily feasible?" "If we had those supplies, yes," the lead officer admitted. "Our walls are strong. Our troops are well trained. We just lack the provisions for extended defense. But, sir," he glanced at Sarah, One person's stores, even extensive stores, won't be easy to move or distribute under siege conditions. That's why we move them now, Sarah said, before the siege is fully established. You have maybe 12 hours before they complete their encirclement. We use those hours to transport everything from my warehouse to the castle's storage vaults. We establish immediate rationing protocols. We organize the civilian population into work groups for water management, sanitation, medical support, and supplemental food production. We turn this city into a survival machine before they cut off all access. That's a massive undertaking, Wynne said. The logistics alone. I've already designed the logistics, Sarah interrupted, pulling additional papers from her bag. Distribution systems, rationing schedules, work group organization, medical protocols, everything. I've been planning this for a year. I just need authority to implement it. Every eye in the room turned to the Alpha King. Kyle stood there for a long moment, the weight of 8,000 lives pressing down on him, the ruins of his council's comfortable assumptions crumbling around him. Then he straightened, and Sarah saw the warrior king who'd won battles in united territories emerge from beneath the diplomatic ruler who'd tried to maintain peace. As of this moment, Sarah Vane is appointed as Emergency Supply Coordinator with full authority to requisition resources, organize civilians, and implement survival protocols, he declared. Anyone who obstructs her orders will be treated as obstructing the crown. Commander, mobilize every available soldier for transport duty. Elder Wynne, begin civilian organization. I want every able-bodied person ready to work within the hour. Your Majesty, the Council, Wynne began. The Council can object when we're not facing annihilation, Kyle said flatly. Right now we're doing whatever it takes to survive. Dismissed. All of you except Sarah. The room cleared quickly, officers rushing to their duties with the sharp efficiency of trained military professionals. When they were alone, Kyle moved to the window overlooking the city. I'm trusting you with 8,000 lives, he said quietly. Everything I am, everything this kingdom is, rests on whether you're as good at implementation as you are at prediction. I know, Sarah said simply. If we survive this, you'll be a hero. If we fail, history will record that I let a grieving Omega widow lead us to destruction. History won't matter if we're all dead. Despite everything, Kyle laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. True enough. All right, Supply Coordinator, show me how to save my kingdom. The next 12 hours were the most intense of Sarah's life. She organized the transport of her warehouse stores using every cart, wagon, and strongback available. Daniel and her work crew became her lieutenants, directing operations with the kind of desperate efficiency that only comes when everyone knows death is the alternative to success. Old Gareth calculated load weights. Marie and Thomas organized sorting teams. Finn the Silent used his precise hand signals to coordinate complex movements without shouting over the chaos. Even the royal courier, injured and exhausted, helped plan routes and timing. The citizens of Grenmar, the same people who'd mocked her preparations for a year, now worked alongside her with desperate cooperation. The dried meat they'd called paranoid hoarding became their lifeline. The massive grain stores they'd said were excessive became their children's survival. The salt reserves they'd questioned became essential preservation material for whatever fresh food they could produce during the siege. Sarah moved through it all like a force of nature, issuing orders with calm precision, adjusting plans on the fly, solving problems as they emerged. She organized the castle's massive kitchens into a central distribution point. She established rationing cards for every citizen, calculated portions based on age, size, and labor requirements. She set up water management systems using the castle's deep wells. She designated buildings for medical treatment, waste disposal, emergency shelter. She turned Kyle's castle into a fortress, not just of walls, but of systems. And then, as the sun began to set on that terrible day, the Eastern Army completed its encirclement. Sarah watched from the castle walls as 30,000 troops surrounded the capital in a ring of steel and fire. Their camp stretched as far as she could see, organized with military precision, supply trains already unloading for the long siege ahead. The smoke from burning villages darkened the horizon. Beside her stood Kyle, his face grim but determined. Around them, citizens and soldiers alike stared at the massive force that had appeared seemingly from nowhere to destroy everything they knew. They're settling in for the duration, Kyle observed. No immediate assault. They're confident they can starve us out. They're not wrong, Sarah said. If we didn't have the supplies, this would already be over. We'd be negotiating surrender within a week. But we do have supplies, because of you. Because of preparation, Sarah corrected. Because someone chose to see what was coming instead of pretending it wasn't. A commotion behind them made them turn. Marcus Thorne was pushing through the guards, his face a mask of barely controlled rage, and something deeper, shame, maybe, or the desperate need to blame someone for his own failures. "This is your fault," he spat at Sarah. "You and your constant agitation, your paranoid warnings. You manifested this somehow. You made it happen." "I made nothing happen," Sarah said coldly. "I saw what was already in motion and tried to prepare for it. You're the one who fought me every step of the way. You could have done more. If you'd convinced us earlier, if you'd been more persuasive, I provided data, analysis, and evidence. You chose denial because it was comfortable. Don't blame me for your cowardice." Marcus lunged forward, but Kael caught him with one hand, his alpha authority radiating in a wave that made the older man stumble back. "Enough," Kael said, his voice carrying absolute command. "We don't have time for blame or regret. We survive or we die based on what we do from this moment forward. And right now, Marcus, you have a choice. You can accept Sarah's authority and work within the survival system she's designed, or you can be locked in a cell until this is over. Choose now." Marcus looked between them, his world clearly shattered beyond recognition. Finally, his shoulders slumped. "What do you need me to do?" he asked Sarah, the words clearly tasting like poison. "Report to Elder Wynn," Sarah said simply. "She's organizing civilian work groups. You'll be assigned where you're needed." She turned back to the besieging army, dismissing him without another word. Behind her, she heard his retreating footsteps, heavy with defeat. "You didn't gloat," Kael observed quietly. "There's nothing to gloat about," Sarah replied. "Being right about disaster doesn't feel like victory. It feels like surviving when you wish you'd been wrong." The first week of the siege was the hardest, not because of military action, but because of the psychological adjustment. Citizens who'd lived in peace and plenty were suddenly facing strict rationing, mandatory work assignments, and the constant presence of an enemy army that had appeared with devastating speed. Panic attacks were common. Arguments over food portions turned violent. The reality of their situation broke minds that had been comfortable for too long. Sarah worked 18-hour days managing the crisis. She adjusted ration calculations as reality proved different from theory. She mediated disputes over food distribution. She redesigned water delivery systems when the first designs proved inefficient. She trained teams of civilians in food preservation techniques so they could process whatever supplemental resources they could generate. Rooftop gardens, livestock pens, rationed fishing from the river that ran through the city. She became the backbone of survival, the person everyone looked to for answers, for solutions, for the assurance that life would continue. And slowly, grudgingly, the pack that had mocked her began to understand what she actually was. Not a mad widow, not a paranoid outcast, but someone who had sacrificed comfort, social acceptance, and peace of mind to prepare for the truth no one else wanted to face. By the third week, when the enemy launched their first major assault on the walls, the citizens of Grenmar fought back with desperate determination. They knew now that those walls were all that stood between them and slaughter. They knew that every day they held was another day closer to rescue. They knew that survival was possible because someone had made it possible. The assault failed. The walls held. The food supplies held. The systems held. And in the Alpha King's war room, planning the next day's defense allocations, Kael looked at Sarah with an expression that had evolved far beyond simple respect. "When this is over," he said quietly, during a rare moment alone, "the kingdom will owe you everything. But I suspect you already know that." "I don't want gratitude," Sarah said, studying the supply ledgers spread before her. "I want survival. Everything else is just noise." Still, the Omega widow who saved a kingdom. "That's the story people will tell." "Let them tell whatever story they need," Sarah said, "as long as the story ends with people alive." But on the 43rd day of the siege, everything changed. Sarah was in the distribution center, managing the evening food allocation, when Daniel burst in with his face pale and his hands shaking. "The western wells are contaminated," he gasped. Something. The water's poisoned. We have 50 people sick already, maybe more. Sarah's blood went cold. Water contamination was a death sentence in siege conditions. Without clean water, disease would rip through the population faster than starvation ever could. "Show me," she said, already moving. She spent the next 6 hours confirming the worst. The western wells, which provided water for nearly half the city, had been deliberately poisoned with something that caused violent illness but didn't kill immediately. A terror weapon designed to break morale and spread disease. "How did they do this?" Kyle demanded when she reported to him. "The wells are inside our walls. They'd need infiltrators, people who could move freely within the city." "They had infiltrators," Commander Frost said grimly, entering with a bound prisoner. "We caught this one trying to poison the southern wells, too." He confessed under interrogation. They've had agents inside the city since before the siege began. Sleeper agents posing as refugees, merchants, ordinary citizens, and there are more of them. The implications crashed over everyone in the room. The enemy wasn't just outside the walls, they were inside, working to destroy the city from within. "We need to close the Western District entirely," Sarah said, her mind already racing through contingencies. "Quarantine everyone who drank from those wells. Shift all water distribution to the Castle Wells and the Eastern Springs. Implement immediate security protocols for all food and water sources. And we need to find the other agents before they can do more damage." "That's 800 people in the Western District," Wynne said, horror in her voice. "If we quarantine them, if the disease spreads, if we don't quarantine them, the disease spreads to everyone," Sarah interrupted. "We save who we can by protecting the rest. It's brutal, but it's survival." The decision was made. The Western District was sealed. 800 people were cut off behind emergency barricades, given what medical supplies could be spared, and left to fight the contamination on their own while the rest of the city implemented desperate security measures. It was the hardest thing Sarah had ever ordered, but it worked. The disease was contained. The rest of the city's water remained clean. The infiltrators were found and neutralized, but the cost in lives and morale was devastating. And then on the 48th day, just when despair was threatening to break the survivors' will, horns sounded from the south. Not enemy horns, allied horns. The sound of cavalry in full charge, the war cry of the Western kingdoms coming to break the siege. Sarah stood on the walls beside Kael as the Allied army crashed into the Eastern forces like a hammer into glass. 30,000 besiegers found themselves suddenly caught between the city's defenses and an army of 20,000 fresh cavalry, and the formation shattered. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it ended, the Eastern army was in full retreat, leaving behind thousands of dead and all their siege equipment. The blockade was broken. Supply caravans were already visible on the horizon, bringing food, medicine, reinforcements. The siege was over. Grenmar had survived. Against impossible odds, with enemies inside and outside their walls, they had held long enough for rescue to arrive. As the gates opened and Allied troops poured in with supplies, Sarah felt her legs give out. She sat down hard on the stone wall, her body finally acknowledging the exhaustion she'd been holding at bay for 7 weeks. Kael sat beside her, his royal dignity forgotten in the moment of pure relief. "We did it," he said simply. "We survived," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." Below them, citizens were emerging from buildings, crying with relief, embracing soldiers, thanking whatever they believed in for deliverance. The pack that had mocked her, the council that had tried to silence her, the kingdom that had dismissed her warnings. All of them alive because one woman had refused to stop preparing. "Sarah," Kael said quietly, and something in his tone made her turn to look at him. "When we rebuild, when we recover from this, I'm going to need someone who understands what survival actually costs. Someone who can help me make sure this never happens again. Someone who—" He paused, searching for words. "Someone who sees clearly when everyone else is blind. You need a supply coordinator? I need a queen." The words hung in the air between them, impossible and inevitable at the same time. Sarah stared at him, trying to process what he'd just said, what it meant, what it would cost, and what it would create. "That's insane," she finally said. "I'm an Omega Widow. You're the Alpha King. The pack will accept what I tell them to accept," Kael said, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "And right now, After everything that's happened, I think they understand that conventional wisdom isn't wisdom at all. Just comfortable ignorance. I don't know how to be a queen. You know how to save kingdoms. Everything else we can figure out together. Sarah looked out over the battered but surviving city, over the people who'd mocked her and then depended on her, over the walls that had held because someone had prepared for them to be tested. Ask me again when we've buried our dead and fed our survivors, she said quietly, when reality isn't quite so raw, when I can think about futures instead of just trying to survive the present. I'll ask you as many times as it takes, Kael said. Because you're right about one thing, survival and victory are different, and I want both. Below them, celebration mixed with mourning as the kingdom began counting the cost of the siege. 800 dead in the Western District. 300 more lost in the fighting, thousands injured, food stores nearly exhausted, infrastructure damaged, trauma that would take years to heal. But alive. Against everything, alive. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself feel the weight of it all, the vindication that felt hollow, the survival that tasted like ash, the impossible proposal from a king who'd learned the hard way that preparation mattered more than comfort. Tomorrow, she would help organize recovery. Tomorrow, she would face the pack that had finally learned to listen. Tomorrow, she would think about impossible futures. But tonight, she simply sat on the wall beside the Alpha King and let herself breathe in the cold air of freedom. The storm had come. Reality had crashed through denial. And she had been ready. The morning after the siege broke brought no celebration, only the grinding work of survival in its aftermath. Sarah woke on a cot in the castle's supply room, where she'd collapsed sometime after midnight, her body screaming protest at weeks of deprivation and stress. For a moment she lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting herself feel the weight of what they'd survived. Then she got up and went back to work. The throne room had been converted into a command center for recovery operations, and Sarah found it already crowded with officials, military commanders, and increasingly desperate citizens seeking answers. Kael stood at the center of it all, looking barely more rested than she felt, issuing orders with the kind of exhausted determination that kept kingdoms functioning when everything else had collapsed. Supply coordinator, he said when he spotted her, and the formal title drew every eye in the room. I need your assessment of our current stores and what we need from the Allied provisions to maintain stability. Sarah moved to the planning table, acutely aware of the hostile stares from several council members who'd managed to survive the siege. Marcus Thorne stood among them, his face a mask of barely suppressed resentment. Commander Frost watched her with a military officer's calculating assessment, as if trying to determine whether she was threat or asset. We have approximately 18 days of current rations remaining, Sarah said, her voice carrying through the room with clinical precision. The Allied supply trains will arrive within 3 days. Priority requisition should be grain, dried legumes, salt, and medical supplies. We need to rebuild our reserve stores while simultaneously feeding a traumatized population that's going to be consuming more calories than normal as they recover from deprivation stress. The Allied commanders are offering immediate food distribution, one of Kael's advisors said. They want to set up relief stations throughout the city. No, Sarah interrupted, and the flatness of her tone made several people bristle. That creates dependency and chaos. We continue the rationing system we've established. We integrate Allied supplies into our existing distribution network. We maintain the structure that kept everyone alive during the siege. The siege is over, Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. We don't need your authoritarian control systems anymore. People should be allowed to return to normal. Normal is what got us besieged in the first place, Sarah shot back. Normal is complacency. Normal is assuming plenty will last forever and preparation is paranoia. If you want to return to normal, you're volunteering to repeat this disaster. You don't get to make those decisions, Marcus snapped. You were given emergency authority during the crisis. The crisis is over. Now, you need to step back and let actual leadership handle recovery. The room went silent, tension crackling like lightning about to strike. Sarah could feel the challenge in the air, the old guard trying to reassert control now that immediate danger had passed, trying to push her back into the role of powerless Omega Widow who should be grateful to have survived and quiet about everything else. Kael's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Supply Coordinator Vane's authority remains in effect until I personally revoke it. which I have no intention of doing. He turned to face Marcus directly, his alpha presence radiating with calculated intensity. She saved this kingdom while the rest of you were denying reality. She organized survival while you were organizing her arrest. So unless you have specific expertise in post-siege resource management that somehow didn't manifest during the actual siege, I suggest you defer to someone who's proven they know what they're doing. Marcus's face went red, then white. Your Majesty, with all respect, the Pack Council failed, Kyle said flatly. Failed to see the threat, failed to prepare, failed to protect. The only reason anyone in this room is alive to argue about authority is because one woman refused to accept your failures as inevitable. He paused, letting that sink in. Now, we can spend our energy fighting over who gets to be in charge, or we can spend it rebuilding a kingdom. Choose carefully, because I'm only offering this choice once. The silence that followed was absolute. Finally, Elder Wynn stepped forward, her usual gentle demeanor strained by exhaustion and something that looked like genuine remorse. "What do you need from us, Sarah?" she asked quietly. Not as supply coordinator, but as someone who clearly understands survival better than any of us. What do we need to do to actually recover? It was the first time anyone from the council had asked her opinion rather than fought her conclusions. Sarah felt something shift in the room's energy. Not acceptance exactly, but the beginning of it. The recognition that maybe, possibly, she knew things they needed to learn. "We need to treat recovery like another siege," Sarah said. "Not an enemy army outside our walls, but the aftermath inside them. Disease, injury, trauma, infrastructure damage, supply depletion. These are threats just as dangerous as soldiers. We need medical teams going door to door assessing health status. We need work crews prioritizing repairs to wells, granaries, and sanitation systems. We need psychological support for people who've been living with death for 7 weeks. And we need to do all of it with the understanding that our resources are still limited, our people are still vulnerable, and complacency will kill us just as surely as the Eastern Army tried to." She moved to the large map of the city spread across the table, marking areas with quick, precise notations. "The Western District is still quarantined. We need to know disease progression before we can safely reintegrate those survivors. The Northern Wall took significant damage during the assaults. It needs immediate reinforcement before weather deteriorates it further. The River District's fishing operations need to restart, but with careful monitoring because we don't know if the Eastern Army contaminated the water upstream before they retreated. And we need to establish a truth and reconciliation process for the infiltrators' families, people who had no idea their neighbors were enemy agents, but who are now being targeted by angry survivors looking for someone to blame." She looked up from the map to find the entire room staring at her with expressions ranging from grudging respect to outright shock. "You've already planned all of this," Commander Frost said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I started planning it on day 3 of the siege," Sarah replied. "Because I knew if we survived, we'd need a framework for what came next. Survival isn't just enduring the crisis. It's having a structure to fall back on when the crisis ends." Frost was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I owe you an apology. I called you unstable. I questioned your judgment. I was wrong." The admission rippled through the room like a stone dropped in still water. If Commander Frost, decorated warrior, respected leader, someone who'd fought beside Torrin in the Eastern campaigns, was acknowledging Sarah's competence, then resistance became harder to justify. "I was wrong too," came another voice. Daniel's father stepped forward, his military bearing somehow diminished by the weight of his own failures. "My son tried to tell me. He said you saw things the rest of us refused to see. I dismissed him the same way I dismissed you, and it nearly cost us everything." "It did cost us everything for some people," Sarah said quietly, thinking of the 800 dead in the Western District. "Apologies don't bring them back. What brings meaning to their deaths is making sure we never repeat the mistakes that killed them." The recovery work began in earnest that afternoon, and Sarah found herself at the center of an operation that felt less like temporary emergency management and more like fundamental restructuring of how the kingdom functioned. She organized teams of survivors into specialized units based on skills and capacity. Those too traumatized for physical labor were given administrative roles tracking supplies and managing distribution records. Those with medical knowledge worked with the healers establishing health monitoring systems. Those with construction experience joined repair crews. Everyone had a role. Everyone contributed. The idle hands that might have turned to despair or violence were given purpose instead. The Allied commanders arrived on the third day with supply trains that seemed endless after weeks of deprivation. Their leader was a grizzled warrior named General Harrow, someone who'd fought in a dozen campaigns and knew the difference between victory and survival. "I've seen sieges before," he told Sarah when they met to coordinate supply integration. "Seen cities that held out and cities that fell. But I've never seen a city this organized after that kind of ordeal. Usually it's chaos, looting, complete social collapse. You've got people working together, following systems, trusting leadership. How?" "Because we gave them truth instead of comfort," Sarah replied. "We told them exactly how bad things were, exactly what it would take to survive, and exactly what would happen if we failed. No false hope, no empty promises, just reality and the tools to face it." Harrow studied her with the kind of assessment only a career military officer could give. "The king said you predicted all of this. The siege, the duration, even the infiltration tactics." "I recognized patterns. My husband taught me to think like a commander thinks. The rest was just mathematics and observation." "Mathematics and observation," Harrow repeated, something like respect in his voice. "And the wisdom to act on what you observed instead of hoping you were wrong. That's rare. Most people would rather die comfortable than survive prepared." He arranged for additional supply deliveries beyond the standard Allied provisions: medical equipment from the Western healing centers, construction materials for fortification repairs, even books and teaching materials for the children who'd lost weeks of education during the siege. Resources that acknowledged recovery meant more than just physical survival. But not everyone was ready to accept Sarah's authority or the changes she represented. On the 8th day after the siege broke, a delegation of merchants arrived at the castle demanding an end to rationing. They'd weathered the siege in relative comfort due to hoarded private supplies, and now they wanted to return to profitable trade without government interference. "The emergency is over," their spokesman declared, a wealthy trader named Voss who'd made his fortune in luxury goods. "Continuing these authoritarian restrictions on commerce is unnecessary and damaging to economic recovery." Sarah met with them in what had once been a formal dining hall and was now a planning center for resource management. Around her were the maps, ledgers, and distribution schedules that had kept everyone alive. "Economic recovery," she repeated, her tone flat. "Tell me, Voss, how exactly does economic recovery work when half your potential customers are still recovering from near starvation? When infrastructure is damaged? When we're still discovering hidden damage from the infiltration campaign?" "That's not our problem," Voss said bluntly. "We took precautions. We prepared our own stores. We survived on our own resources. Now we want to trade freely without your distribution controls limiting what we can sell and for how much." "You prepared your own stores," Sarah said slowly, "and kept them hidden during the siege, while others starved, while children died in the Western District. You had food, and you kept it private rather than contributing to collective survival." "We had no obligation to share what we'd purchased with our own money," another merchant interjected. "Property rights don't disappear during emergencies." "Actually, they do," Kale said from the doorway, and everyone turned to face the Alpha King. "I signed emergency requisition orders during the siege. Anything that could have contributed to survival should have been declared and integrated into distribution systems. You deliberately hid resources that could have saved lives." Voss's confidence faltered slightly. "Your Majesty, surely in recovery we can return to normal commercial practices. What you're calling normal commercial practices look an awful lot like hoarding and war profiteering from where I'm standing," Kael said, moving to stand beside Sarah. "And I'm not inclined to reward that behavior with unrestricted trade privileges." "This is exactly what we feared," Voss said, his voice rising. "This woman has too much power. She's turning you against your own economic base, making you think like a tyrant instead of a king." "I'm thinking like someone who watched people die because others prioritized profit over survival," Kael interrupted. "And if that makes me a tyrant in your eyes, I'm comfortable with that judgment. Sarah, what do you recommend?" "Continued controlled distribution for essential goods until we've rebuilt adequate reserve stores," Sarah said without hesitation. Luxury goods and non-essentials can return to open market immediately. Let them make their profits on things that don't determine life and death. But food, medicine, building materials, fuel, those remain under coordination until we're confident another crisis won't immediately collapse us. How long? Voss demanded. 6 months minimum. A year more likely. However long it takes to ensure we never face starvation again. The merchants erupted in protest, but Kael silenced them with a gesture. Those are the terms, he said. Comply or lose your trade licenses entirely. Your choice. After they left, angry but compliant, Kael turned to Sarah with something like amusement in his exhausted expression. You're making a lot of enemies among people who used to have considerable influence. They'll have influence again eventually, Sarah replied, but not at the expense of survival, never that. The real test of her authority came 2 weeks into recovery when the Western District quarantine was finally lifted. The disease had burned through the isolated population, killing 300 and leaving the rest traumatized, not just by illness, but by the knowledge that they'd been deliberately abandoned to protect the wider city. Sarah had known this moment would be the hardest, reintegrating survivors who had every reason to be furious with the leadership that had sealed them off. She went to meet them personally, walking into the Western District without guards, without royal escort, just her and Daniel and a medical team. The survivors watched her approach with hollow eyes and expressions that mixed grief, rage, and exhausted resignation. At their head stood a woman named Kessa, who'd lost her husband and both children to the contamination. You locked us in here to die, Kessa said, her voice raw with pain. You decided our lives were worth less than the rest of the city. I decided 800 lives were worth the 8,000 who would have died if the disease spread, Sarah replied, not flinching from the accusation. It was a brutal calculation. It cost you everything, and I take full responsibility for that choice. Responsibility, Kessa spat. What does that mean? You're still alive. Your people are still alive. We're the ones who buried our families. I know, Sarah met her eyes directly, and nothing I say will make that acceptable or fair. You have every right to hate me, every right to demand justice. But what I can offer, what the kingdom can offer, is this. We remember. We honor your losses not with empty words, but with structural change. Every person who died here died because we were unprepared, because we didn't have enough medical supplies, enough clean water, enough redundancy in our systems. We're fixing that. And we're making sure your family's names are recorded as the people who saved the kingdom by bearing a burden no one should have had to bear. That's not enough, Kessa said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. I know, Sarah said again. It never will be. But it's what I have to offer, that and a promise that we'll never make the same mistake twice. That preparation will matter more than comfort. That we'll face truth instead of hiding from it. Your families died for that lesson. The least we can do is actually learn it. The silence stretched long and painful. Then Kessa stepped forward, and Sarah braced for violence. Instead, the woman put her hand on Sarah's shoulder with a grip that was somewhere between threat and plea. Don't let it be meaningless, she whispered. Don't let them die for nothing. Make it matter. I will, Sarah promised. Every day, in every decision, it will matter. The integration of the Western District survivors became a model for how recovery could honor trauma rather than dismiss it. Sarah organized memorial services that were honest about what had happened and why. She established support groups led by healers trained in trauma response. She gave survivors priority access to resources and positions of influence in the new systems being built, making them partners in reconstruction rather than victims to be managed. And slowly, grudgingly, the anger transformed into something more complex. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that hard choices and impossible situations didn't have easy answers or comfortable resolutions. 3 weeks after the siege broke, the Pack Council called a formal session to address Sarah's continued authority. It was meant to be a reckoning, a moment where the emergency powers would be revoked and normal governance would resume. Marcus Thorne had been organizing for it, gathering allies among those who resented Sarah's influence and wanted a return to traditional power structures. The council chamber was packed with citizens when Sarah arrived, everyone wanting to witness what many expected to be her political execution. She wore simple clothing, her work dress, cleaned but still showing signs of weeks of constant use. No royal trappings. No attempt to look like anything other than what she was, an Omega widow who'd done what needed doing. Marcus opened the proceedings with barely disguised satisfaction. We're here to address the continued emergency powers granted to Sarah Vane during the siege crisis. The crisis has passed. Allied forces have secured our borders. Supply lines are restored. It's time to return governance to its proper structure and remove the extraordinary authorities that were necessary during the emergency but are no longer appropriate. Murmurs of agreement rippled through portions of the crowd. Sarah noted who nodded, who looked uncomfortable, who watched her with hostile anticipation. Before we vote, Elder Wynn said carefully, perhaps we should hear from the supply coordinator herself. Sarah, do you have anything to say about your continued role? Sarah stood, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. I have no interest in power for its own sake, she said clearly. I never wanted authority. I wanted survival. But if you're asking whether the emergency is truly over, whether we can safely return to the comfortable assumptions that nearly destroyed us, then my answer is no. The murmurs grew louder, more agitated. We're still vulnerable, Sarah continued. Our reserve stores are rebuilding but not yet sufficient. Our intelligence networks failed catastrophically and haven't been reformed. Our early warning systems proved useless. Our medical infrastructure nearly collapsed under siege pressure. Our social cohesion fractured when tested. All of these are ongoing threats that don't disappear just because the immediate military danger has passed. So you want to maintain dictatorial control indefinitely? Marcus challenged. I want to maintain survival systems until they're institutionalized, Sarah corrected. I want supply coordination until we have permanent staff trained to continue it. I want emergency preparedness integrated into normal governance, rather than being something we panic about only during crisis. I want the lessons we learned written into how this kingdom functions instead of being forgotten the moment comfort returns. And you think you're the only one who can do that? Marcus's voice dripped with skepticism. No, Sarah said simply. I think I'm the one willing to be unpopular to do it, which seems to be a rare quality around here. Laughter erupted from portions of the crowd. Bitter, exhausted laughter from people who'd spent weeks following orders they resented, but that had kept them alive. Let's be clear about something, Sarah continued. I didn't save this kingdom because I'm special or gifted or blessed with unique insight. I saved it because I took reality seriously when everyone else was treating it as optional. I did math when you did wishful thinking. I prepared when you celebrated. I acted when you denied. Anyone could have done what I did. You just chose not to, because it was uncomfortable. The chamber had gone silent, her words hitting like physical blows. So here's what I propose, she said. I'll step down from emergency authority the moment you can show me functional systems that don't require my constant intervention to maintain. Show me supply coordination that works without me. Show me emergency preparedness that doesn't evaporate the moment I'm not watching. Show me a council that can face hard truths without needing someone to force them to pay attention. The day you can demonstrate that, I'll happily return to being the crazy widow in the cottage who dried too much meat. That's blackmail, Marcus said. That's standard, Sarah replied. And if you can't meet them, maybe that says more about your leadership than mine. Before Marcus could respond, Commander Frost stood. I move that we table the vote on removing Supply Coordinator Vane's emergency authority, he said formally. Not indefinitely, but for 90 days. Time enough to implement the systems she's describing. Time enough to prove we can function at the level required for actual security rather than comfortable illusion. Seconded, said Elder Wynn quietly. This is ridiculous, Marcus protested. You're letting her manipulate. I'm letting her set standards we should have had all along, Frost interrupted. My son told me something during the siege. He said Sarah acts like reality matters more than reputation. I dismissed that as youthful idealism. I was wrong. Reality does matter more. And if we can't meet basic standards of preparedness and competence, then maybe we deserve to have our authority questioned. The vote was called. Sarah's emergency powers were extended for 90 days, with a review and assessment to follow. It wasn't victory exactly, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that the old ways had failed and new structures needed time to take root. After the session ended, as the crowd dispersed and council members left with varying expressions of relief or resentment, Kyle approached Sarah in the now empty chamber. You could have pushed for more, he observed. Could have demanded permanent position, formal title, anything you wanted. The crowd would have supported you. I don't want what I can demand, Sarah said tiredly. I want what can sustain itself. The moment I'm gone, everything I've built needs to continue functioning. That only happens if it's integrated into the kingdom's normal operation, not dependent on my personal intervention. You're thinking like a queen, Kael said softly. I'm thinking like someone who wants to retire eventually, Sarah corrected. I'm exhausted, Kael. I've been exhausted for over a year. I don't want power. I want to know that if I stopped tomorrow, people would still eat. Children would still be safe. The kingdom would still prepare instead of pretend. And then what? After it's all institutionalized and functioning? What do you want then? Sarah looked at him, at the Alpha King who'd bet his kingdom on trusting her judgment, who'd fought his own council to give her authority, who'd asked her to be his queen in the aftermath of siege and survival. Ask me in 90 days, she said, when I'm not too tired to think about futures instead of just getting through the present. I'll ask you in 90 days, Kael agreed, and every day after that, until you're ready to answer. He left her alone in the chamber, and Sarah stood there in the silence, feeling the weight of everything that had happened and everything still to come. Outside, the city continued its recovery. Wells were being repaired, walls were being reinforced, supply systems were being refined. The kingdom was learning to function with preparation as priority rather than afterthought. And in her cottage, empty now for weeks, gathering dust while she worked endless hours in the castle, her drying racks stood as monuments to the paranoia that had saved them all. Sarah had been right. She'd been right about the war, right about the siege, right about what it would take to survive. She'd been right when everyone else was wrong, and now she had to live with being right, with the knowledge that vindication tasted like ash and salvation cost everything. But they were alive, against everything, impossibly, brutally. They were alive. And tomorrow she would make sure they stayed that way. Tomorrow arrived with frost on the ground and the sharp clarity that came with autumn mornings in the frontier kingdom. Sarah woke in the small room Kael had assigned her in the castle's administrative wing. Not royal quarters, not Omega chambers, just a practical space near the supply coordination center where most of her work happened. She dressed in the same efficient manner she'd cultivated over the past year, pulled her silver-streaked hair into its customary braid, and went to check the morning distribution reports. The 90 days passed like water through cupped hands, necessary, sustaining, and somehow both endless and insufficient. Sarah trained teams to manage supply coordination, passing on everything Torin had taught her about logistics and everything she'd learned through trial and brutal error during the siege. She established permanent protocols for emergency preparedness, reserve storage requirements, and early warning systems. She created redundancy in every critical system so that no single point of failure could collapse the kingdom's survival infrastructure. And slowly, carefully, she began to let go. It was harder than she'd expected. For over a year, her identity had been built around preparation, around being the one who saw clearly when others were blind, around carrying the weight of survival on her shoulders because no one else would. Learning to trust others with that weight felt like learning to walk again after a crippling injury, painful, uncertain, requiring faith in muscles that had atrophied from disuse. But Daniel proved himself an exceptional logistics coordinator, his youthful energy combined with meticulous attention to detail. Marie had a gift for organizing people and mediating disputes over resource allocation. Old Gareth's structural engineering knowledge became invaluable for fortification planning. Even Finn the Silent found his niche in inventory management, his precise hand signals evolving into a whole system of visual communication that proved more efficient than written reports for certain types of data tracking. The crew she'd hired in desperation became the foundation of a permanent emergency management department that would outlast her personal involvement. On the 43rd day after the siege broke, Sarah returned to her cottage for the first time since the invasion. The place felt like a museum of her former life. The drying rack still standing empty, the root cellar depleted but structurally sound, the maps and calculations she'd left behind now vindicated but no longer necessary. She stood in the main room, running her fingers over the table where she'd compiled all that evidence, where she'd fought to make people see what they refused to acknowledge. The silence felt heavy with ghosts. Not of Torin, though his absence still ached like a partially healed wound, but of the woman she'd been. The desperate widow working alone in the dark, certain of disaster and terrified no one would listen until it was too late. "I thought I might find you here," Kael's voice came from the doorway. Sarah turned to find the Alpha King standing in her modest cottage, looking somehow both out of place and perfectly natural. He'd shed most of his royal bearing over the past weeks, working alongside his people in recovery efforts with a humility that had won him respect that mere authority never could. "I needed to see it again," Sarah said. "Remember why I started all of this?" "And why did you start it?" "Because Torin made me promise I would survive, that I would prepare, that I would think clearly even when everyone else was emotional, that I would choose reality over comfort no matter how hard that choice became." She gestured at the empty cottage. "I kept that promise. But I don't know who I am now that the crisis is over. I don't know how to be Sarah without being the woman who's preparing for disaster." Kael moved into the room, studying the maps still pinned to the walls. "You could stay here, go back to being the widow in the cottage. I'd understand." "Would you?" "No," he admitted. "But I'd respect it. You've earned the right to choose peace over responsibility." "Peace," Sarah repeated, tasting the word. "I'm not sure I know what that is anymore. For a year, every decision I made was life or death. Every calculation mattered. Every choice had consequences measured in survival or extinction. How do you go back to ordinary life after that? How do you care about normal things when you've seen how fragile everything actually is?" "You don't go back," Kael said quietly. "You go forward. You find new purpose that acknowledges what you've learned rather than pretending you can forget it." "Ja." He moved to stand beside her at the table, and Sarah was suddenly intensely aware of his presence, not as Alpha King, not as commander or authority figure, but as a man who'd spent 90 days working alongside her, learning from her, trusting her judgment even when it cost him political capital. "I'm going to ask you again," he said, not as a king making a political alliance, but as a man who's found someone he trusts more than anyone else in his life. "Sarah, will you be my queen?" The question hung between them like a blade suspended on a thread. Sarah felt the weight of it, the impossibility and inevitability of it all at once. "Give me a reason," she said. "Not duty or gratitude or political necessity. Tell me why you actually want this." Kael was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the maps that had saved his kingdom. "Because you see truth when everyone else sees what they want to see," he finally said. "Because you choose hard, right over easy wrong every single time. Because you're the only person I've met who values survival more than comfort, who understands that leadership means making choices others will hate you for, but that keep people alive." He turned to face her. "And because somewhere during the worst crisis of my life, I fell in love with the woman who refused to let my kingdom die, even when my own council was trying to silence her." Sarah's breath caught. She'd expected political reasoning, strategic justification, pragmatic arguments about stability and capability. She hadn't expected honest emotion from a man trained to rule rather than feel. "I'm not easy," she said, her voice rough. "I'm difficult and controlling, and I see disaster in everything because I learned the hard way that disaster is always possible. I don't know how to be soft or yielding or any of the things an Omega Queen is supposed to be." "I don't want soft or yielding," Kael replied. "I want someone who will call me on my mistakes, who will challenge comfortable assumptions, who will make sure this kingdom never forgets that preparation matters more than celebration. I want a partner who understands that love and trust are built through crisis, not despite it." "And if I say yes?" Sarah asked. "If I agree to this impossible thing, what happens to the widow who dried too much meat?" "She becomes the queen who saved a kingdom," Kael said. "And then she spends the rest of her life making sure no one ever has to save it again." The frost outside caught the morning light, turning everything crystalline and sharp. In that clarity, Sarah made her decision. "Ask me properly," she said. "Not in my cottage where I was broken. Ask me in front of the kingdom, where everyone can see what you're choosing and why." Kael smiled. A real smile, not the diplomatic expression of a king, but the genuine warmth of a man who'd found something worth celebrating. "In front of the kingdom it is," he agreed. The announcement came 3 days later during the formal ceremony marking the end of emergency governance and the transition back to normal administration. The throne room was packed with citizens, council members, allied representatives, and survivors from every district, including the traumatized remnants of the Western Quarter. Sarah stood beside Kyle as he addressed the crowd, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, aware that many of those gazes still carried judgment, resentment, confusion about how the Mad Widow had risen so far. 90 days ago, we extended emergency authorities to Sarah Vane because we needed her expertise to survive recovery, Kyle said, his voice carrying through the chamber. Today, those emergency powers end. The systems she built are functioning independently. The teams she trained are competent and capable. We no longer need a supply coordinator with extraordinary authority. Sarah saw satisfaction flicker across Marcus Thorne's face, saw others who'd resented her influence begin to relax. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the return to normal, the end of the widow's inexplicable power. But we do need something else, Kyle continued, and the satisfaction began to fade. We need to acknowledge a truth that's uncomfortable for many in this room. We need to admit that our traditional leadership structures failed catastrophically when tested. We ignored warnings. We dismissed preparation. We prioritized comfort over caution and nearly paid for that choice with extinction. The room had gone silent, tension building with each word. One person saw what we refused to see, Kyle said, turning to face Sarah. One person chose preparation over popularity, action over denial, survival over social acceptance. One Omega Widow had more wisdom, more courage, and more genuine care for this kingdom's future than our entire council combined. Marcus started to object, but Elder Wynn put a hand on his arm, silencing him. Sarah Vane saved us, Kale said simply. Not just during the siege, but before it, when she prepared while we mocked. During it, when she organized while we panicked. And after it, when she taught while we resisted. She saved us from the enemy outside our walls and from our own stubborn blindness. He turned back to the crowd, his alpha authority radiating through the chamber. And now I'm asking her to save us one more time, to take a role that will ensure we never forget what she taught us, to stand beside me not as supply coordinator with temporary powers, but as queen with permanent authority to challenge, to question, to demand that we face reality no matter how uncomfortable that becomes. The shock rippled through the room like a physical wave. Someone gasped. Several council members looked like they might faint. Even those who'd supported Sarah seemed stunned by the audacity of the proposal. Kyle extended his hand to her. Sarah Vane, will you be my queen? Not because you're Omega or because tradition demands it, but because this kingdom needs someone who will never let us choose comfortable extinction over difficult survival? The silence was absolute, everyone waiting for her response. Sarah looked at the extended hand, at the man offering it, at the kingdom full of people who'd mocked her and then depended on her and now had to decide whether to accept her as their queen. I will, she said clearly, taking his hand. On one condition. Name it. That we establish a formal council of preparedness with authority to override comfortable decisions when survival is at stake. That we enshrine in kingdom law the principle that preparation takes priority over profit. That early warning must be taken seriously. That the person who sees danger first must be heard rather than silenced. She looked directly at Marcus Thorne. That we make it structurally impossible for this kingdom to ever again choose denial over reality. The demand was radical, unprecedented, a fundamental restructuring of how power would function. Sarah watched Kyle absorb the condition, saw him calculating political cost against necessary change. Granted, he said without hesitation, we'll draft the charter together and present it to the full council for ratification. And anyone who objects to preparing for survival can explain to the 800 dead in the Western District why their comfort matters more than other people's lives. The vote was called. The council, still reeling from the double shock of a queen being chosen for competence rather than breeding and a formal preparedness mandate being written into law, split sharply. Marcus and several traditionalists opposed, but Commander Frost voted in favor. Elder Wynn, after a long pause, voted in favor. One by one, council members who'd lived through the siege, who'd seen what denial cost and what preparation achieved, voted to accept the Mad Widow as their queen. The final count was 17 in favor, 8 opposed. Not unanimous, but overwhelming enough to be legitimate. Then it's decided, Kyle said, still holding Sarah's hand. Sarah Vane will be Queen of Grenmar with full authority to ensure this kingdom never again confuses peace with permanent safety. The throne room erupted, some in celebration, some in dismay, most in confused acknowledgement that the world had changed in ways they were still struggling to understand. But the moment that mattered most came later, after the formal ceremony ended and the crowds dispersed. Sarah stood on the castle walls at sunset, looking out over the city she'd saved, and found herself surrounded by an unexpected group. Daniel and Marie. Old Gareth and Finn the Silent. Kira the merchant who'd first brought evidence of Eastern military preparations. Kessa from the Western District, her face still haunted by losses that would never fully heal. Commander Frost, with his son. Even a few of the council members who'd voted against her but were present anyway, curious or concerned or simply trying to understand. "So you're our queen now," Kessa said, not quite a question. "I'm going to try to be," Sarah replied. "I don't know if I'll be any good at the ceremony and politics parts, but I can make sure we're never unprepared again. I can make sure the people who see danger first are heard rather than silenced. I can make sure your families didn't die for nothing." "That's all we ever wanted," Kessa said quietly. "For it to matter. For the lessons to actually be learned." "They will be," Sarah promised. "I'll spend every day making sure of it." "You're going to be insufferable," Daniel said, but he was grinning. "A queen who demands everyone prepare for disasters that might never come. The court is going to hate you." "The court can hate me as long as the kingdom survives," Sarah replied. "I'm comfortable being unpopular. I've had practice." Old Gareth laughed, a rough sound that nevertheless carried genuine warmth. "You know what the people are calling you, in the markets, in the taverns, in the working quarters?" "The Mad Queen?" Sarah guessed. "The Winter Queen," Gareth corrected. "The one who prepares for hard seasons. The one who sees storms coming and makes sure we can weather them. It's meant as respect, not mockery. You've changed what power means in this kingdom." Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not quite healing, because the wounds of the past year would never fully close, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that pain could transform into purpose, that loss could become legacy, that the woman who'd prepared alone in the darkness had become the queen who would ensure no one ever had to prepare alone again. The sun set over Grenmar, painting the recovered city in shades of gold and crimson. Below, people moved through streets that were still being rebuilt, past walls that were being reinforced, through market squares where supply distribution continued under protocols Sarah had designed. The kingdom was learning to function with preparation as priority, with caution as wisdom, with the understanding that comfort was always temporary, but survival required constant work. Sarah stood there surrounded by the people who'd believed in her when everyone else called her mad, watching the city she'd saved prepare for whatever came next. And for the first time in over a year, she felt something other than exhaustion or determination or grim calculation. She felt hope. Not the naive hope of people who believed good times would last forever, but the hard-won hope of survivors who knew disaster was always possible and chose to prepare anyway. The hope that came from facing reality and building systems that could endure. The ceremony of coronation came 2 weeks later, elaborate and formal in ways that made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. She wore the traditional Omega Queen's gown but insisted on modifications. Practical sleeves, pockets for notes, and small tools, fabric that could withstand work rather than requiring delicate care. She spoke vows that had been rewritten to emphasize duty over decoration, responsibility over romance. And when the crown was placed on her head, not the delicate circlet traditionally given to Omega Queens, but a substantial piece that matched Kael's own crown in weight and presence. She felt the full reality of what she'd become. Not just a queen, not just a survivor, but a symbol of a fundamental truth that this kingdom would carry forward. That the people who prepare are wiser than the people who celebrate. That caution is strength rather than weakness. That facing hard reality is more loving than offering false comfort. The feast afterward was both celebration and working session, with Sarah spending most of it discussing supply chain improvements with merchants, fortification strategies with military commanders, and early warning protocols with scouts and intelligence officers. She moved through the crowd not as a gracious hostess, but as a woman ensuring every conversation served the purpose of making the kingdom stronger, more prepared, more capable of surviving whatever came next. "You're supposed to be enjoying yourself," Kael murmured when he found her in deep discussion with the head of the Merchants Guild about establishing emergency reserve requirements. "I am enjoying myself," Sarah replied. "This is what I enjoy. Making sure we're ready. Making sure the lessons stick. The lessons will stick, Kyle assured her. You've made certain of that. For now, Sarah said. But memory fades. Comfort returns. People forget. In 5 years, or 10, or 20, they'll start to think the good times are permanent again. They'll start to see preparation as unnecessary expense rather than essential investment. Then we'll remind them, Kyle said. Together. That's what we do now. We're the permanent reminder that peace is temporary and survival requires constant work. Sarah looked at him. At her king, her partner, the man who'd bet everything on trusting her judgment and had won a kingdom's survival as his reward. You know they're going to write songs about this, she said. The mad widow who became queen, the Omega who saved the Alpha's kingdom. They're going to romanticize it, make it into a fairy tale where love conquered all and everything ended happily. Let them, Kyle said. We'll know the truth, that it wasn't love that saved us, though love helped. It was mathematics and preparation and the stubborn refusal to accept comfortable lies. That's not romantic, but it's real. Real, Sarah repeated, tasting the word. Yes, that's what matters. Not the story people tell, but the truth we live. The feast continued late into the night, and somewhere around midnight, Sarah slipped away to the Supply Coordination Center, her old command post, now staffed by the team she'd trained. They looked up in surprise when the newly crowned queen walked in wearing her coronation gown. Your Majesty, Daniel said, starting to bow. Don't, Sarah said. Just show me today's distribution reports and next week's provision calculations. I want to make sure the systems are holding. They worked together for an hour, Queen and logistics team, reviewing data and refining protocols. It wasn't romantic or ceremonial or anything that would appear in the songs. It was practical, necessary, and exactly what Sarah needed. When she finally returned to her new quarters, the Queen's chambers that she'd already begun reorganizing into something more functional, she found Kyle waiting for her. I wondered where you'd gone, he said. Should have known. Couldn't sleep without checking the numbers, Sarah admitted. Old habit. Good habit, Kyle corrected. The day you stop checking the numbers is the day we're in trouble. He held out his hand and Sarah took it, letting him draw her close in the privacy of chambers where they could finally drop the public personas and just be two people who'd survived hell together and chosen to build something from the ashes. I'm not good at this, Sarah said quietly. The romance part, the partnership part that isn't about crisis management and survival planning. Torn and I never had time to figure that out before he died. I don't know how to be someone's partner when the world isn't ending. Then we'll learn together, Kyle said. We'll make mistakes and figure it out and probably drive each other insane with our different approaches. But we'll do it while making sure the kingdom stays prepared, stays safe, stays capable of surviving whatever comes next. That's the least romantic thing anyone's ever said. I know, Kyle replied, and kissed her anyway. The seasons turned. Winter came harsh and testing, but Grenmar's reserves held because Sarah had built redundancy into every system. Spring brought news of continued eastern instability and the possibility of renewed conflict, but this time the kingdom was ready because warning signs were taken seriously rather than dismissed. Summer saw the formal ratification of the Council of Preparedness and the establishment of kingdom-wide early warning networks. And through it all, Sarah worked. She refined protocols, trained new coordinators, traveled to remote districts ensuring that preparedness culture spread beyond the capital. She was demanding, difficult, uncompromising in her insistence that survival mattered more than comfort. But she was also respected. The mockery had died, replaced by grudging acknowledgement that maybe, possibly, the Mad Widow had been the sanest person in the kingdom all along. 1 year after her coronation, Sarah stood in her old cottage for what she knew would be the last time. She donated it to the kingdom as a training center for emergency coordinators, a place where people would learn the skills that had saved them all, in the exact location where those skills had been developed. The drying racks had been restored and were being used again, not by her, but by students learning preservation techniques. The root cellar had been expanded into a demonstration site for proper storage methods. The maps on the walls had been preserved under glass as historical documents showing the intelligence work that had predicted the siege. It's a museum to your paranoia, Daniel said, standing beside her in what had once been her workspace and was now a memorial to the importance of preparation. It's a reminder, Sarah corrected, that the person who sees danger first deserves to be heard, not mocked. That preparation is wisdom, not weakness. That the most important courage isn't fighting the enemy at the gates, it's having the strength to prepare when everyone else is comfortable. She turned to leave, but paused at the door for one final look at the place where everything had started. The desperate months of work while everyone laughed, the calculations that proved correct, the systems that saved a kingdom. "Thank you," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking. Turin, maybe, for teaching her to survive. The universe, perhaps, for making her stubborn enough to act on truth when everyone else chose denial. Or maybe just herself, for having the courage to be unpopular in service of keeping people alive. She closed the door and didn't look back. The kingdom spread before her, recovered, stronger, fundamentally changed by the understanding that survival required constant vigilance. She was their queen now, not because of breeding or tradition, but because she'd proven that wisdom came from facing reality rather than hiding from it. And as she walked back toward the castle where Kael waited, where her council of preparedness would meet to review threat assessments and discuss new protocols, where a kingdom had learned to value the people who dried too much meat and saw storms before they arrived, Sarah finally understood what Torin had meant in his final days. Peace never lasts, but preparation endures. And the people who choose difficult truth over comfortable lies are the ones who save everyone else when reality inevitably arrives. She'd been mocked, dismissed, called mad and broken and paranoid. She'd been everything they said she was, difficult, controlling, unable to accept easy comfort when hard truth was available. And she'd saved them all anyway. That was power. Not authority granted by crowns or councils, but the fundamental power of someone who refused to let others die just because facing reality was uncomfortable. Sarah Vane, the Winter Queen, walked toward her future with her head high and her heart finally, carefully learning to be at peace with being right. Not because vindication felt good, it never really did, but because being right had kept people alive, and that was the only thing that had ever truly mattered. The kingdom had learned its lesson. They would prepare now. They would listen when warnings came. They would never again laugh at the person who dried too much meat, because they understood that survival had a name, and that name was preparation.